So I welcome comments, questions, as we talk. Michelle and I, you very generously wrote a little introductory text for the show, which was wonderful. And I feel like we're friends, but also, you could do a little introduction of because you work more with Parasceva than you have with me.
This is true.
Yeah.
So I'll just start actually so I'm Michelle Gewurtz, and yes, I've known Panya for, a while.
Years probably.
Not quite that much, but close. I can plot out. I'm an art historian by training, so I can do the dates. Yeah, and I just wanted to start by actually thanking you for the opportunity to write about this body of work, or to at least get back into thinking about it a little bit, because as Panya says, we go back a while. And when I first met Panya, I was like, I'd love to work with her one day. So this is just a tiny, tiny opportunity that I'm very thankful for at this moment. And so yeah, I actually first came across Panya and her work when I was researching Parasceva Clark. I came across a little postcard in the Parasceva's artist file at the National Gallery of Canada. So my doctoral work, part of it was on Parasceva Clark. I was looking at politically engaged women, political small p, and really more how art history and through curatorial practice, certain artists come in and out of visibility. And so I came across Panya's a little advertisement, a little postcard really, for Panya's show that she did in 1994 that originated Vancouver Art Gallery and then traveled. And so what Panya was doing then was working with her grandmother's paintings. Were they all in NGC's collection? I don't think so.
No, some were in private collections, some were in public collections.
Yeah.
Yeah, so part of it was borrowing the paintings from various different people. But we had, in order to include a painting in that exhibition, which was called Reappearances, we needed to have something that was being depicted in the painting. So part of it became visiting people that owned her paintings. And for example, like Alice Sutton had her portrait done by Parasceva. When I visited Alice to see the work, she said, oh, well, I actually have my hat and my dress that I was wearing when my portrait were done. So those objects came into the exhibition alongside the chair, which Parasceva still owned. So it was an artwork where I was bringing her paintings back in relationship with objects that she depicted in the paintings.
Yeah, and you were kind of creating the spaces, because Panya's concern really is about kind of space, the environment, and kind of how we, I guess, relate to. Very crudely, you can speak better to it than I can. But I mean, then I went back and I was like, oh, this, you're Panya Clark at that time. I looked you up to wonder, because my practice has always kind of toggled historical and contemporary art across different media. And lo and behold, I emailed you, you responded. And then when I was back home in Toronto, we met. And you actually facilitated a lot of my thinking and research around Parasceva's practice, because you showed me some of the objects in the work that I was interested in writing about. And so that is how we met, and we've kept in touch over the years. I think we sort of almost have like a 10-year, going back to my thesis, this idea of an elliptical, that's sort of how our relationship has worked. 10 years ago, I curated a show at the Ottawa Art Gallery, a window on Parasceva Clark, and I was, and that Panya and I met.
My sister and my father and mother here, we traveled to Ottawa at that time. And had a lovely dinner with your parents as well. Yeah.
So we go back a little ways. But we can talk, I think the interest here really is around the artwork, but the reason I wanted to start with that show is because I believe this piece, this over here is really
this is a nice place to start, because this is an excerpt from that exhibition, Reappearances, where we have the tablecloth. This is Parasceva's tablecloth. And I wanted her paintings to be seen also as objects. So in that exhibition, I was doing a lot of taking the paintings off the wall, leaning the paintings against the wall and things like that. So I took her painting and I put it down on top of the tablecloth, and it suddenly sort of realized that, oh, of course, the tablecloth is not painted in perspective at all. You know, it's completely flat. In fact, I can sort of almost see like she's traced out the tablecloth. And so this amazing visual trompe l'oeil effect happened where I felt like I could really almost reach through the painting at this tangible surface of the tablecloth. And so I just love that. It surprised me at the time. It excited me a lot. And so when 5 years ago I started weaving, I thought, you know what, I would love to circle back to this particular textile. That's what I'm doing in a lot of the works in this show is first just learning how to weave this particular pattern, which is a double weave, which I'll refer to a lot in the talk because just on a technical level, a double weave is when you're weaving 2 layers of fabric at the same time, and the threads are they can either be completely separate from one another or they can exchange places. So, you know, therefore you get the opposite happening on the back side than what you see on the so-called front side of the cloth. Yeah, so, you know, the works in this room, there's a lot of different things that I could say about them. The narrower pieces were done on a table loom. The thing about this particular pattern, in order to weave it, you need to have 16 shafts on the loom. So just on a technical level, when you're weaving, you have the warp, which is under tension from the back to the front of the loom, and you're weaving into it the weft. And so when those threads pass through the loom, one needs to decide when you're warping up the loom which frame to attach the threads to, which heddles to bring the threads through, and that determines what patterns you're able to weave. And so in the case of this double weave with this particular pattern, you need to have 16 of these shafts, 16 of these frames available. So that's a fairly, it's sort of common and uncommon. Like, yes, there are many looms that have that many shafts, but a typical day-to-day loom has 4 shafts. So anyway, I could wander all over the place with it, but when most of this work was made while I was in Berlin, in 2024, I did a residency at the Kunstlerhaus Panya, which is not a textile-related residency at all. There was no equipment at the Battanian for me to use, so when I arrived in Berlin, I needed to seek out ways to weave the things that I was interested in weaving. Just to go back to the overall show, there are 3, like in this chapter of work, there are 3 Paris Gala Clark works. Summer Night in the front room, Still Life of Alabaster Grapes, and then on the back wall in the corner there is Kitchen Cupboard Aspect. So when I went to Berlin, I took reproductions of these 3 paintings with me. The piece in the front room I had made before going. I made that piece in 2022. And then I thought these 2 works I'd like to think about and work on while I'm doing this residency. I'm just going to take a drink of water.
Sure. Yeah, okay. One thing that I like about weaving is one of the things Panya is very, very good at, and I want to venture that your grandmother, and of course I do not know Paris Ava Clark, because I mean I can tell you how old I was when she passed away, but date myself, but I was small. Is that I think this bringing together of people in community is something that you and your grandmother really have in common, and I know you and I have talked a lot about Paris Ava was quite vocal at certain periods, and I'm thinking in the 1930s, you know, about what the role of the artist was then. And you and I have talked a little bit about her perception of that, and but also, you know, reflecting now on what is the role of the artist and what is the role of art. But I mean, one of the things, aside from Panya really teaching me how to read
Periskeva's paintings, which you have done, you know, that the still lifes are actually not still at all. They're moving. There's a lot of movement in the painting, and I mean, in the same way that that textile is moving right now. But Panya has a really good way of bringing people, I think, together, and I understand that you did that in Berlin when you went, and there was no equipment. And
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the weavers of Berlin.
Oh, sure. Yeah. This lack of weaving equipment. I mean, you know, weaving is new to me. I've done many different sort of methods of making art over the years. Most of the time, my practice has not started with a technical method at all. Like I've done all kinds of different sorts of fabrication and sculpture installation pieces in many different mediums. So starting to weave, which I did over COVID, kind of sent me down this rabbit hole because weaving is very technical, and there's a lot that one needs to learn in order to be able to actually control the outcome of weaving. So I went down the weaving rabbit hole and spent a couple of years here weaving, and then when I went to Berlin, I lent out all my equipment and went to an empty room. But that ended up turning out to be such a gift because it sent me out into the city of Berlin to find looms and to find weavers. And by the time I left Berlin at the end of 2024, we had started a Weavers of Berlin group. There are just 5 of us in the group. But I felt like just completely honored and touched by this little community that had, apparently my coming to Berlin had precipitated this coming together of weavers. So it was just a very gratifying experience. And some of this work was done in studio because I did end up purchasing a couple of looms to have in the studio there, but then also sent me out into other weaving studios. And so, I've kind of been ruminating over this aspect of social practice in art making, and what Perisceva was thinking about in terms of representing political and social contexts, and asking myself if I'm doing that. It's sort of an open question for me.
We've got, we could talk a little bit about Perisceva, or do you want to move to since we're here, we've got the alabaster grapes. We have the grapes as well. There. There's a lot of stuff to unpack with this series of works that stem from recreating that textile. Or just answering questions.
Of course, in the first challenge is to weave the cloth, to be able to make it, but then the second question that comes up is, what do I want to do with the weaving? What am I trying to explore? And really, these smaller pieces along this wall are experiments with the color, experiments with creating light and shadow, trying to actually bring the weaving closer to the painting than to the sort of very stark red and white of the original tablecloth, but actually picking up on the color combinations that come in the painting and really trying to warm up the weaving and make the weaving more expressive of the experience of the painting. And so along this wall, I'm experimenting with different ways to create shadow, different ways to bring color into the work. This involved dyeing the work threads before they were put on the loom, and then dyeing the weft threads as well before they were woven into the fabric. Experimenting with opening up the weave so that there was a kind of performative feeling to the weaving, which, when you're at the loom and the threads are coming up and down, it's very sculptural and very dimensional. There's a dimensionality to it that when it's when everything's woven and sealed off, doesn't show up, right? It's something that happens that when you're at the loom. So that piece was an attempt to leave that kind of open performative feeling to it. And
Yeah, I mean, if you want to stop here, I really like how you've like deconstructed like you've really pulled it apart. And then what was interesting for me was the fraying and how the pattern starts to like, you know, how you start to actually unpick and not be precious about the material. But I do, I mean, these ones, you know, it's like, is it stained? There's a bottle of wine there. In fact, it's not stained. You know, but you're really kind of playing with color, or like how these materials come together and then are broken apart, which to me was interesting to think about. You know.
Yeah, I ended up calling this series, this red and white series, Blood and Freedom. And I came across that description of red and white, the red and white that are used in Eastern. I mean, this could very well probably have originated, this tablecloth, from an Eastern European context. I don't know where it came from, but it's linen and it's handmade. So I imagine that Parasceva may have brought it from Russia with her, but I don't know that as a fact. But the red and white, I went to another exhibition in Potsdam when I was in Berlin, and a Belarusian artist had red and white embroidery work in the exhibition. And she referred to the red and white as being blood and freedom. And when I picked up on that, I thought that was really interesting for me, because when you're working up the loom and you're making all those decisions about the threads and what frame they're being attached to and so on, you're sort of setting the DNA of the cloth in a way. You're making a lot of decisions that are then predetermined in what you're working with. But then as you weave, there is a huge amount of freedom in terms of what can be done with that DNA. So this piece here, you know, what I'm doing at the top is fully integrated, proper patterning of the original pattern. But as I'm going down, and in this case with these wider pieces, I'm working on a manual Dobby loom, which is a loom that has a chain of wooden bars that get fed through the loom, and pegs in the wooden bars that determine which shafts are being raised and lowered. So it makes the weaving much faster to do, much faster to do. But it also, for me, created this opportunity to program the loom to do a fully integrated weave, but then as I was continuing to weave, to randomly pull pegs out of this programming chain and allow the weaving to transform and to change. So this is where the freedom comes. And the warp on most of these weavings is cotton. The weft colors that I ended up bringing in to bring it closer to the painting are silk threads. So as I was allowing this, it's almost like deprogramming the pattern. As I allowed this transformation to take place, what happens is the silk weft threads become dominant on one side of the weaving, and on the other side, the cotton warp threads become dominant. And so the quality of the fabric changes, the pattern changes, and you know, it takes on the cloth takes on different characteristics. So of course, as I'm doing this, I'm thinking, what am I trying to do with this weaving? What is this about? I'm thinking about Parasceva, and as many of you may know, Parasceva was a very, let's say, promiscuous woman. She gave herself certain liberties in life, which sometimes were very uncomfortable for my grandfather. But she did proclaim a couple of times about her lovers, and she's quite well known for that. So there was a moment where I thought, well, we're taught, of course, not to touch weavings or to touch artworks, but cloth is very conducive, obviously, to touch. And I ended up thinking, I really want to have something that shows us more about the fabric than when it's just hanging. So I grabbed the fabric and clipped it together at the back with clothes pegs, which are a nod to Paraskeva's peasant roots, which never disappeared in her life, and did what I sort of coined as a crotch grab. So this piece is called the Provocateur, and it's now sort of infused with this, with Paraskeva's spirit, for me anyway, which was much admired in Berlin, I have to say. Every woman that I showed this story with was like, yes. Anyway, so there's a sensuality. I brought the weaving down to touch the floor intentionally to give it also that relationship to somehow the earth and to, I don't know, a little indiscretion, I suppose. So that's sort of an example of where some of the ideas went to for me.
I want to actually pick up on a couple of some of the language you're using. You talk about weaving being DNA, and obviously, of course, there's this element of like legacy or inherited or something. I mean, ancestry for sure, intergenerational dialogue. The show is called, I Am Your Window. But of course, you're also disturbing, very quite deliberately. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I think about, like, for me, learning about Paraskeva's life from a very different way, and art is not limited to biography. I'll just foreground that, at least not in my view. But I mean, red and white, Paraskeva, there was the Russian Revolution, which allowed her to be an artist, the Russian Reds, the Whites. If you would have to know a lot about history to remember, who. But I mean, these are the conditions of possibility that allowed her to pursue art, and there was a freedom in that. And then, of course, getting transposed to Canada, I remember reading or learning about from the family. I mean, the fact that it was scandalous that Paraskeva Clark wore bright red lipstick. I mean, and when you told me how people were reacting to this, that they were shocked, and I was thinking, why? That's so weird to me. But, okay. So there's a lot of kind of layers, but I don't know as we move, because, Panya is interested, I think, in, this idea certainly of legacy and what her role is, but you're also quite interested in actually looking at the liberties. Yes, she took liberties in life, but she also took quite a lot of liberties and risks in her work, and I think that you're, some of that interest for you is like, okay, she was your grandmother. She's, but she's also this figure, and certainly in Toronto, where you've chosen to live and work and raise a family and to go into this line of work yourself. So there's a lot that we could, I'm just thinking of how we move around also.
I think there's a degree of intimacy because she is my grandmother, but also we never spoke about art, and I feel like I never actually had a dialogue with my grandmother. I was the youngest of 3 kids. Family dinners were lively. And by the time I was in art school, she was in a nursing home and had lost much of her memory. And so there was contact, but not really we never knew one another as artists. And so I also love spending time with her work because for me, it's a way to kind of build a dialogue with her work and with her as a person through the paintings. And so maybe we could talk about the one at the end. This one, the kitchen cupboard aspect, was one where I curious about her painting. I had sort of set this project to weave as a conduit for collaboration. And I had been working on the red and white work in Berlin, and I had this other painting or a reproduction of this painting with me. And then I thought, well, what do I want to do here? And But as I was spending time in Berlin, I ended up going to some antique markets and meeting a friend, making another friend who was really into the antique markets. And so, going to the antique markets, I started to see that there were all of these linen towels that were for sale. You could buy a stack of them for 15 euros. And I thought, I've done all this very labor-intensive weaving. Maybe there's a way I can work with cloth that was woven by others. And it seemed somehow very appropriate to this work because the theme being kitchen cupboards, there isn't anything particularly decorative about this work. It's a very abstract piece. And yet I was also really drawn to it because I have done a lot of work where I've taken imagery and like a photograph and reconstructed what I see in the photograph, or taken a reproduction. I did a piece called The Silence in the Storm where I took reproductions of Tom Thompson paintings and repainted them. So this idea of kind of rematerializing dimensionality from a representation of some kind. So I became very curious about this work, and I had been in her kitchen as a child, although I hadn't spent much time there, but I knew certain things about the kitchen, and I thought, well, given these white towels that I've collected, maybe there's a way that I can actually reconstruct the architecture of the kitchen cupboards using these suspended towels. And so I wanted to sort of see, by reconstructing the architecture, how the light actually fell on the cupboards. Was there an angle that this could be seen from where the light and the shadow would align to the shape of a rectangle? I was just really curious about it and had a lot of fun playing with this reconstruction. Then it kind of dawned on me, oh right, the window in her house was facing the north side, was facing north. There was a hill behind the house. I thought, well, actually the light coming through this window would have been bouncing off the wall or the hill behind her house. So maybe I should actually use a mirror. And around the time that I was working on this, there was an open studio event at the residency. And so there was a day where I had a studio visit with someone, the open house was coming, and I decided, you know what, I'll do this as a performance piece. So I ended up doing a durational performance, setting up a slide projector, holding this mirror, and playing with, I did actually end up taping the mirror to myself and using the bouncing light of the projector plus different colored gels and things to perform being her window. So that's where this phrase, I am your window, came from. And it just kind of has carried forward into the whole body of work. Yeah, so this is this piece. I have a question.
Yeah.
Any thoughts in particular?
What's the title of the original?
It's called Kitchen Cupboard Aspect. Yeah. Yeah, and it's from the 1950s as well. Like all three of the works in this show are from sort of later on in her career. Yeah. Yeah.
Or Eastern Europe, but I have to imagine that the imagery or the symbols have some cultural significance. Have you sort of been able to look into that or think about
Of the other objects in
No, I mean literally the patterns of the weave, because you use it throughout the
Yeah.
wing work. So
Yeah.
I wonder, often in textiles you get these sort of iconography that gets transmitted across time.
I haven't specifically looked at this, although curiously, when I collected the tablecloth, these other white ones, the exact same motif is in the light linen weaving from Germany. You know, so I do think that these patterns are partly just, you know, things that one is able to weave, and they become, you know, quite common motifs. But no, I haven't looked into,
Yeah, Panya, it's a great question.
Yeah,
Panya, the exhibition that you saw in Potsdam, the artist, there's this really neat website actually that where she's actually started to do research. She's Eastern European herself.
She's Belarusian.
Belarusian, so it's
Yeah.
the same area that Parasceva, like the Plistic family, originated from. I mean, and about how the act of weaving and making the textiles what became in that period, like a sort of way of communication. Of course, textiling.
Sure.
There's a way to communicate certain things to those who knew how to read. Whereas this might be, but yes, that would, I don't know enough.
Yeah, me neither.
But we were sort of interested, and I was interested in that just in terms of, again, Panya's relationship to her grandmother and like ways of reading artwork or what you kind of experience like when looking. Because you said, and this idea of being a window, because a window is not a mirror, you're not reflecting, or projecting yourself onto Parasceva or this identity of, and it's a very particular identity that she had, which also was inconsistent. Like one of the things you're interested in is this sort of paradoxical, that art in the 1930s and 1930, what's the role of the artist as art come out from behind the Cambrian shield, if that for Parasceva, she was very vocal about art having an activist role, around, like that art was supposed to drive social change, because of course for her, that was what was going on when she learned to be an artist. And then she would rail when she would, I would use that word, like loblaws, landscape. It's like this. And then, as if, well, she came here, it was, I'm going to paraphrase, like kind of a backwater, everybody group of seven, there's this dominant, where's her place in this? She's a woman, super gendered, not, the Arts and Letters Club, which her biography is in that library in Toronto, not because of her as an artist, because of her grandfather. So that book is, there's all these things that she's trying to carve out identity, trying to find a place for herself. But then ironically, most of her output is landscapes.
Yes, of the 475 artworks that more or less that she made, there's this handful of works that had this political this overt political content. But she did loads of landscapes and still lifes and portraits and and many other things, and experimented quite a bit with different styles
and perspective and because I know there's the work that you at the beginning, like if we wanted to
maybe we should talk about the summer night piece here. Whoa, so, and I think what inspired me to weave it was when I started learning double weave, which has this very graphic and just the graphic possibilities with double weave led me to want to weave this particular work, and in doing so, I thought more about her at that time in her life. This was painted in 1969. After the Second World War, she really lost touch with her friends and family in Russia. Any kind of, in those days, of course, it was only letters really that could go back and forth, and the letters would be confiscated. So I think in 1948, she reached out to a cousin to try to learn about what had happened with her family during the Second World War, and never really heard back, never really knew. So in 1986, she died not really knowing what had happened to her friends and family. Later on in the 1990s, we did receive a communication finally from her cousin, and actually just caught the last week of his life to have a communication back and forth. And so, I just think about, by 1969, of course, my sister and my brother had been born, she had family and friends here in Toronto, but this kind of existential, I think, very deep loneliness that she must have felt not knowing how her brother had died or where her sister was and those kinds of things. This painting made me think about that. And the painting's called Summer Night, and of course we see, these are the windows in her house that had this kind of these leaded panes, and the moth at the window. So I wove one rendition and then left the length of warp and wove another one. And I was just thinking about these two windows being separated from one another and that kind of space in between. And the moths ended up, I of course hadn't incorporated the moth into the window when I was doing the double weave. But later on, I worked with Amanda McCaver, who's another Toronto artist who does stitching using a sewing machine, and she very generously helped me make these moths. And so, in different iterations at different times, depending on how the piece is shown, the moths appear. A couple of them are lingering in this web in between these two worlds. And then some of them are making their way to the window over there. So this is where, there's stories that come that inspire the makings of the pieces. And then inevitably there are also stories that show up in the making of the work that I think keep both the origin stories alive, but also allow kind of new stories to be told with my own practice or with my own life. So I like this idea of disbursement and maybe, kind of maybe healing a bit of that loneliness that existed in her world at that time. Yeah. So I'm just thinking, what else?
Yeah, I don't know. That seems like maybe a good place to take some questions.
Yeah.
How did you take classes in weaving? Or how did you learn this? You seem pretty masterful now.
I can answer that. Okay, you go ahead, Mom.
And inherited my aunt's background in becoming a master weaver. She was born in Newmarket, but became an astronomer, and then through astronomy eventually got into weaving, and which was her pastime. So she decided anyway became a master weaver through the process that they have to establish that in Canada, for example. And anyway, so
just
had the opportunity
that the loom you use?
and used that as a springboard.
I asked Panya too a similar question about, I don't remember if I asked you or I knew you were weaving, but you talked about actually another ancestor as well.
Yeah, that's true. So there's a story that was written by my great-grandfather in his memoirs about our great-great-great-grandmother Jane Dick, who was living in Northern Ireland in Ballymena, working in her father's linen weaving studio. And when I hear these stories, they just, the story that inspired me with her was that Harold, my great-grandfather, shared that that Jane wove linen in her father's linen weaving studio, but it was a very restrictive society, very Protestant. There was a very limited number of books that she was permitted to read. But she would borrow books from the neighbor's son and put them under the warp while she was weaving, surreptitiously put them under the warp, and that according to my great-grandfather, she could recite Burns's poems and Scott's Lady of the Lakes, which she had learned at the loom. So when I hear these kinds of stories, I think, I really should learn how to weave linen. So around the time that COVID came, Liz Keed, who's another amazing Toronto weaver, gave me a 4-shaft Fanny Leclerc Fanny loom. And then COVID came. And over COVID, I joined Jane Stafford's online weaving guild. And so she's a West Coast weaver who lives out on Salt Spring Island, who taught weaving for decades. And about 9 years ago, she decided to start recording herself weaving and putting up all of this content online. And the woman is incredible. She has created a fantastic online guild that I just dove into over COVID. So I started watching like real time, how to make a warp, how to, just real time video documents about how to weave. And then, over 9 seasons now, she's built a whole catalog, a whole library of online weaving resources. And so, COVID gave me the opportunity to spend some time just sampling, making tea towels, and I would never, ever refer to myself as a master weaver. I have too much respect for the people that actually are master weavers. I did this at one point. If I sat down and I tried to do this again today, I would be like, okay, let's get the learning curve going again, because you get into it, and then when you step out of it, there's a lot to get. It's like it's like technology, right?
Yeah.
You leave the program for a couple of years, you come back, you don't recognize the dialogue box anymore.